All right, today we're going to talk about topic 6-2, which is parallel and perpendicular slope. In the first section, we talked about what slope is, and it's this definition again. It's slope is the direction and steepness of a line. And there's two important distinctions when we're talking about slope when we have multiple lines. The first thing are parallel lines. Parallel lines are lines that never intersect. So they never, ever, 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 ever touch. So for example, if I were to draw this on a graph, parallel lines would look something like this. These lines will never, ever, 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 ever touch. They run forever in both directions and will never touch. And that's the important thing to remember about parallel lines. Now we're talking about parallel lines and slope. This is the very important concept of this section when we're talking about parallel lines. Parallel lines have the same slope. So make sure you have that box that in somewhere. That's very, very important to remember. Parallel lines have the same slope. So if two lines have the same exact slope, they're parallel. And we'll look at some examples in just a second. The other important distinction when we're talking about lines are perpendicular lines. So perpendicular lines intersect and form four right angles. So, for example, if I were to draw out what that looks like on a graph, we would have something similar to this right here. This would be an example of perpendicular lines. These lines intersect, and when they intersect, if I were to zoom in right here, they make four right angles. And we talked about what right angles are. Right angles are angles that equal 90 degrees. So it's important to understand when lines are perpendicular, especially when we're talking about graphing. And the slopes between those perpendicular lines have a special relationship. So this is the other very important concept of this section. Perpendicular lines have opposite reciprocal slopes. And again, we'll look at exactly what that means as we look at some examples. So down here, I'm going to make a chart. I'm going to go, or I'll do some examples here. So for example, if we had, let's start with slope here, and then we'll go parallel slope, and then perpendicular slope. So if I started with, let's start with 2/3. If the original slope, or m, was 2/3, the parallel slope to that, we talked about earlier, parallel slopes are the exact same. So that's easy. The parallel slope to 2/3 would also be 2/3. Now when we're talking about perpendicular is opposite reciprocal. So opposite, we know, means you change the sign. That's what we've been talking about. And then reciprocal means you flip the fraction. So for this example, the opposite reciprocal would be -3/2. So that would be the perpendicular slope. So we'll look at some more examples. If we took 4, the parallel slope to 4 would obviously be 4. Now when we're talking about perpendicular slope, we know it's the opposite reciprocal, so we know it's going to be negative. And now we have to flip the fraction of 4. Well, 4 as a fraction is the same as, and I'll write it over here, is the same as 4/1. these two things are equal. 4 and 4 over 1 are the same. So if I wanted to get the opposite reciprocal, that would be negative 1/4. Again, I take that fraction, I flip it, I put a negative sign on it. Let's look at another example. If I had the example negative 1/3 as my slope, the parallel slope would be the same, which is very simple, would be negative 1/3. And then if I looked at the perpendicular slope, it would be the opposite reciprocal. So opposite means it'll be positive. And then when we flip 1/3, if I flip 1/3, I get 3 over 1, which is the same thing as just 3. So on that one, my perpendicular slope would just be positive 3. Again, because it's the opposite and I flip the fraction. Let's look at one more example. If I had negative 11 over 7, the parallel slope to that would be negative 11 over 7 because we know it's the same. And then if I wanted to talk about the perpendicular slope, it's the opposite reciprocal, which means I take the opposite of the sign that's on there, which would be positive, and then I flip the fraction. So the perpendicular slope would be 7 over 11. Now, we've got now that we've got the examples of what parallel and perpendicular slope look like, I hope that makes sense to you. If you got any questions, make sure you write them down, and I'll see you in class.